We spent several weeks looking at the chapter 3 of James, and we've had some very good discussions. In this last part, we spent a week or two looking and comparing heavenly wisdom versus earthly wisdom. We looked at the different characteristics of earthly wisdom, how that it is not from heaven, that it's sensual, it's demonic, and the finished product of this type of wisdom is disorder and every evil thing. In contrast with that, last week we took a look at the characteristics of wisdom that is from above. And of course, we're talking about heavenly wisdom here. And we saw how that it was first pure, it was then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, and full of mercy and good fruits. And that's where we finished up last week looking at that section. We've got a couple of more to go through, a couple of more characteristics to finish up looking at wisdom that is from above. And the next one is that it's without partiality. This disposition is unwavering. This is how it's translated in the New American Standard Version. It's unwavering or without vacillation. And so it's without partiality. It does not change depending on the circumstances or depending on the individual that maybe you are confronting or speaking with or having to deal with. Each individual is different in their makeup, but this shouldn't affect how we treat different individuals. You know, we treat one individual the same as we would another individual as far as maybe, you know, we have to treat different people, or we have to treat people differently sometimes because of their emotional makeup. You know, maybe we need to approach someone differently in that respect. But what we're speaking about here is maybe our concern for someone. Maybe we're more concerned for this person because, you know, maybe they have more money or something like that. Their position in the community is different. Maybe we're very quick to rebuke this person, but yet not this other person. You know, in those aspects, we need to be without partiality. We need to make sure that we're treating everyone the same and that we don't show prejudice. Our love is not with prejudice. We're not preferring one person over another person. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 21, it says there, I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. And so here, the Holy Spirit allows Paul to tell Timothy that he needs to be that he doesn't need to do anything with partiality. You know, doing nothing with partiality. And so here again, we see this attitude that we should have of when we go out and when we interact with others, we shouldn't have this. We shouldn't give some special treatment and others not. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 10 says there, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. And so here again, this you know, it's treating one another the same, brotherly love. I don't possess this brotherly love that compels me to treat this brother differently than another brother. And the author of our book, you know, he makes a statement that is true, that we may be drawn closer to some than others. And this is just human nature, because we have more in common with some people than we do others. We maybe have similar hobbies. We may have similar occupations. Maybe, you know, you have couples maybe that are drawn to other married couples because they have children about the same age. And so we have different interests. We have different characteristics that may lead us to be drawn closer to other people. You look at Christ's relationship with John. He is spoken of as the disciple that John loved. You know, you look at John chapter 19 and verse 26. You know, Christ loved all of his disciples, and I believe he loved them equally, but yet it seems that he had this special relationship with John in some way. And so we can have that special relationship with others, but that's not going to lead us down this path of ultimately treating them differently and giving them preference as far as the things that we had mentioned before. And so we can be closer to some than others and do so without this idea of showing partiality to these people. If I'm very good friends with someone, that's not going to keep me from speaking with that person if I see sin within their life, or making an excuse for that person if they do sin, if they do fall. I'm not going to defend them in that sin. I will rebuke that. I will stand against that sin just as much as I would someone who I'm not as close to. And so as Christians, we need to be without partiality. The wisdom that we possess, that we endeavor to have in our lives, should be wisdom that is without partiality. Any comments on that?
Which tie in a little bit, I think. But I was thinking of this as you were talking. It made me think of this right here in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20, talking about Paul, how he dealt with things. He said, "To the Jews I became as the Jews, that I might win the Jews. To those under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." So you deal with people different, but the same in a sense, I guess.
He had equal love for those people, and he was willing. He was dealing with them differently, but that love prompted him to do that. That equal love prompted him to do that. He's not. He doesn't go, I like to live in this manner, so I'll do that here, but I'm not gonna do it over here with these folks, because he was willing to give himself and to make those conciliations in order to help them. And so it was that equal love for these folks. Any other comments? Yeah, I think we talked about it some last week, but in connection with this, it's also a good point. Any other comments there? And this wisdom from above is without hypocrisy. Our faith must be sincere. Paul again speaks of the sincere, genuine faith of Timothy's mother and grandmother in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5. And there he calls Timothy to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am also persuaded in you also. And so we have this genuine faith, this faith that is without hypocrisy. It's genuine, it's not fake. We're not play acting. We must not play act with God. We must not be hypocritical in our actions. Our faith must be sincere and without offense. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 through 10, it says, "In this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and in all discernment, that you may approve all things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense to the day of Christ." And so our faith must be sincere. Our actions must be sincere. We must not be play acting. We must not be the type of person that is one way when they're around Christians and another way when they're around people of the world. We must have a sincere faith and without hypocrisy. And I think all of us understand this, and we know what hypocrisy is. And so we need to make sure that the wisdom that we are seeking is one that is not a hypocritical wisdom. And we're not going to be doing things that are hypocritical in our life. Any comments on that?
It almost looks like one, and I don't know I'm aware of the definition, the general definition of the word partiality.
Yeah.
But it almost seems like, that, one leads to the next, has a greater tendency to lead to hypocrisy when you're partial.
Yeah.
Because, you may teach certain things, but then here you do, like you were saying, you do one thing for this person, and you might teach it, hey, this is the way it ought to be. But then when a situation arises, now you're partial towards this person. You favor this person, but you teach, you ought not favor this person, favor people. I'm not saying I'm not saying that's what he's done here with these two words, but I can see where they closely relate to one another.
And really, when you look at this entire list, I think they all build upon themselves. We talked about how that, the way he said it's first pure. You have to start with pure motives. If you're pure, it's going to be easier to be peaceable. If you're peaceable, it's going to be easier to be gentle. If you're willing to yield, if you're gentle, it's going to be easier to be willing to yield, then full of mercy, then partial. And so it builds upon itself that way. But I think, as you said, you can go backwards from that as well. And so, if you're hypocritical, you're going to be partial, and then, things like that. And so I think that's a very good point, how I think all of these are interconnected. And so that's a good point with how that those are connected. And I think they all are. And the way this list is laid out is just really, is to me, is just, great in how he did that and laid that out, how that they are all built upon and interconnected there. Any other comments? And so as he ends the chapter there, or this part of his letter, James says, now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those that make peace. And so those who demonstrate these qualities of character are in complete contrast to the lovers of strife. And so we spent some time speaking about those who might love strife and those who try to promote strife, but those who exhibit this fruit, these fruits that we see, that these characteristics of this wisdom, and of course that's the fruit that someone would bear if they have this type of wisdom. They are in direct contrast with those who sow strife. And so they sow the seed of peace and reap the peaceful harvest which issues from righteousness. And so this is the type of people that we need to be. This is the wisdom that we need to have present in our life. And so when we contrast that with earthly wisdom, we can see a huge difference. And as we go out and we deal with people in the world, therefore we can judge as we interact with others if the type of wisdom that they are presenting to us, if that's earthly wisdom or heavenly wisdom. And so we need to make sure that we have that ability and we understand the differences in these two types of wisdom there. Therefore, we can make sure that we not only have that present in our life, but as we go and seek advice from others and listen to what others are saying, we can understand where they are coming from. So as we finish up chapter 3, any other comments or anything that anyone would like to add before we move on to chapter 4? All right, as we move on to chapter 4, we're on page 121 if you're following along in our book. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the first 7 verses of chapter 4 of James. So let's go ahead and we'll read James chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. James says there, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasures at war in your members? You lust and you do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. I was listening to Steve Klein teach a class on James. I think he did so 2 or 3 years ago, and I was listening to him teach this part of the book of James. And the way he titled it, and I thought it was a good title, was Choosing Our Friends, the World or God. And so that, I think, is what James is trying, the point he's trying to get across here in this section of his book is, we've talked about earthly wisdom, we've talked about heavenly wisdom, and so now we need to choose sides. Are we going to be on the side of earthly wisdom? Or are we going to be on the side of God and heavenly wisdom? And so we need to choose our friends, either the world or God. He also made the point that the book of James mirrors the Sermon on the Mount in a lot of different ways. And I had not really thought of that, but as you look at James and then you start thinking about the things that Christ was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, I think we see a lot of correlation, a lot of similarities there. You look at what Christ said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And so we see, I think, a direct correlation with what James is talking about here to some of the things that Christ was teaching there on the Sermon on the Mount. And so we see that and we see those correlations, and we have that reinforced not only by Christ, but as James is writing to the Christians here in his letter. So the first part of this chapter deals with people who are trying to serve God and mammon. And we understand, and James again points that out, just like Christ did, that there is no way to succeed in doing that. When you have someone who is trying to serve God, but yet they want to still serve the world in a small part, ultimately what they end up doing is serving the world. They become an enemy of God. Their attempted friendship with the world makes them an enemy of God. And so Christ pointed that out. James would point that out. He will reiterate that as we go through this chapter here. So the book of James offers, this correlation. It offers other correlations with the Sermon on the Mount. And also we see a lot of correlations with the book of Proverbs as well. In writing about this section of Scripture, Brother Lynn Hedrick had this to say. He said, "It seems to me that James is dealing with two related matters, with the inward struggle against the world which individual Christians face, and the ugly fightings among brethren expressed by the wrong use of the tongue, stemming from a desire to satisfy their own pleasure." And so here we see, as we go through this, we'll see that we have this inward problem, this inward struggle that each of us deal with. And there is a war within us. That the desires of the world, the desires of the flesh, these lusts that we may have, these things are warring within us. And that war within us sometimes comes out and expresses itself in fights and arguments against our brethren, against those that we come in contact with. And in addition to this, we might have other sinful behavior because of this war and struggle that we have within us. And all of this, I believe, is wound up in what James is speaking about in this first part of this chapter, of this section of his letter. And so as we see, he begins by looking at the proper attitude toward worldly lust. And we ask the question, well, what causes conflict? What causes these conflicts? And so he gives us the answer there in verse 1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? And so where do conflicts come? They come from the desires, these inward desires for pleasure that war within us. So following the discussion of two kinds of wisdom, James proposes this question, and it demonstrates what occurs when one rejects this wisdom that we just spoke about that brings peace, when we reject that wisdom and when we start accepting the wisdom of the world. And so we ask the question, well, what causes human conflict? Well, bitter jealousy and selfish ambitions for possessions and power. And so much of the conflict that we have within the congregation, within relationships, maybe in our occupations and our jobs in the country, when we look at the world as a whole, so much of that is bound up in bitter jealousy and this selfish ambition and this ambition for power. And I want to have preeminence, and I want to be over other people. We discussed this in chapter 3 and verse 14. And so this gets at the root of so much of the human conflict that we see today. In this context, James is speaking of quarrels and dissensions between individuals. And so thus, when we look at this, the words that he uses here are translated wars and fighting. I believe we should understand that as these figurative wars and fighting. So figuratively, it would mean quarreling, conflict, and strife. When we look at other versions and how they translate verse 1 here, is the English Standard Version says, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you?" The New International Version says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you?" The New American Standard says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you?" And the Contemporary English Version says, "Why do you fight and argue with each other?" And so we see these other translations take this figurative language that we have in the King James and the New King James and really put it where I think it needs to be, these conflicts on an individual basis here. But the analysis, however, is true even when we take it on a broader scale and apply, even in a more broader sense, even when we get to wars between nations. Coveting what another has, whether on an individual, national, or international level, is the basic cause of war. So those of us who have studied history and look at history and read about it, and we see this. This is the basic cause of war, strife, and conflict are the things that we are discussing here. And so no matter what level we put this on, when we get to an international level or we get it on a level where it's just between two individuals, I think this is true all the way across the board. This is where the majority of these conflicts, this bitterness, this strife comes from, is because of this. Does anybody have anything they want to say along those lines? By using the phrase there, among you, that we see James using, I think it's safe to infer that James is speaking of, in this chapter, or in this section of his letter, conflicts within the church. It is the war in the heart which causes wars in the church and elsewhere. And so when we look at who the book is addressed to, the letter is addressed to, it's addressed to Christians. And so, he says, among you, I think he is dealing with these conflicts, these things that are happening among Christians, even in the church there. So we see that lust for worldly pleasures wage war in our hearts. We spoke about that a little bit in the beginning of when we started talking about this chapter, but the lust for worldly pleasures wage a war in our hearts. And so this is a war, I believe, that is a continual battle that we have to face, or that we face maybe even on a daily basis, maybe not, I don't know, but we can kind of tamp that thing down, and it may not be as much of an issue at some points in our lives as they are at other points. But I think it's something that we have to be continually battle, and we can get those things under control as we get older, as we become more mature. But if we don't watch it, that battle will begin raging within us again. We look at some other passages, Galatians chapter 5. And beginning with verse 16, it says, "I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish." And so here again, we see Paul speaking of how that these things are warring against each other. And that if we give in to those things, then our goals, we're not going to reach the goals that we have of following God and living for Him and promoting His kingdom and things like that. If we drop down there again in Galatians 5 into verse 24 through 26, it says, "And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with the passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." And so here again, he's reiterating what James is teaching, that we need to crucify these passions, these desires. We need to win that battle within ourselves and not allow that to come spewing out and causing all this conflict that we see so many times all around us. And so when we understand what lust is, and like we've said before, we all have different desires. What causes me issues within my heart may not be at all an issue with you. You know, someone may have issues with envy or maybe envy about power or something like that, and maybe I don't. Maybe you have issues with coveting worldly things, like you want a bigger house or a bigger car or something like that, or a better car, and maybe another person doesn't have that, but we're all warring against, we each have these desires, these lusts within us. It may be sexual, it may be material, but there are different things that we are susceptible to. But lust within itself is not a sin. When we look at these desires within themselves are not a sin. When we look at James chapter 1, if we back up there and read verses 14 and 15, we see this progression of these desires and when these things become sin. It says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." And so these desires, this lust in and of itself is not sin. It's when these covetous desires are allowed to go unrestrained. It's when we do not restrain these desires and we begin maybe concentrating on them or just letting them kind of rule our mind and our time, and then they go unrestrained, and then they develop into these sins. These attitudes may develop into envy and hate. When sexual desires go unrestrained, they will cause sin as well. We must keep these things restrained. We must keep this battle within us under control at all times, or this thing is going to turn into sin. Any desire or ambition can lead us into sin. We need to be asking ourselves, does our job hinder our service to God? It's okay to, of course, we understand we must work, so it's fine to have an occupation. But is that occupation, do we allow that to take over and hinder our service to God? Does our ambition to be promoted or to gain status at our job, is that causing us to do things that we shouldn't do? Do our leisure activities hinder our service? Again, it's okay to take time to relax, to do things that we enjoy, to have hobbies, to spend time with other people doing different things, and these things in and of themselves are not wrong. But when they begin hindering our service to God, then they become sin. We've allowed them to go too far, and we are losing that battle within us. So an acid test is to measure how important the fulfillment of that desire is in one's heart. Does it consume our thoughts and plans? Is it utmost in our thoughts and plans? If we are making plans maybe to participate in this activity, are we going to do that? And do we make plans for that first and then think about God later? A lot of pleasurable things happen on the weekend. And so you have a lot of people planning these things and they never even think about God or worshiping God or remembering the death of Christ and things like that. And so they make their plans first and then they think about God later, or even if at all. Would we do anything to get what we do not have in connection with this? Are we going to sacrifice relationships? Are we going to maybe step on others in order to achieve these goals and to do these things? And so, we look at our news and how that is filled with trials for murder, divorce, civil suits, all of these things. And, we look at all of these court cases and all of that. And if we get to the bottom of it, nearly every court trial, the basis of it is greed, envy, and uncontrolled lust. The vast majority, if not all of them, when you get down to the basis of them, it's these type of things. And so children of God must be aware of this root cause. We must guard our attitudes to prevent being caught in the snare of these things that Satan has put in front of us. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, it says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul." And so we must be ever vigilant on our guard at all times to not allow these lusts, this inward war, for Satan to begin winning this inward war so that it spills out and begins causing issues on the outside. Any comments there?
Go ahead, Dave. I don't think he'd mind me telling this. I wanted the sinister nature of yielding to the lust of the flesh. Where brethren can't get along, they war, and they don't mean to be that way. See, peace requires love of soul. It's a lot involved. Like Jeremy, if Jeremy didn't like you, man, he'd have a little while, and we're not friends any longer. I don't have friends that don't promote peace and love. Rex was in this meeting. Brother Sutton and Rex, the elders were meeting, and a brother here cussed him out, basically. He might remember this, but the point I'm getting at. So the brother here basically cusses him out, calls him some stuff. Well, this flies all over Brother Sutton. Well, I'm going over, I think he and I was arguing the second service. We were discussing the Lord's Supper. I had my Bible, he's out tending to his horses. Well, when I walk up, he brought up, what do you think I ought to do? This brother, we got a serious problem. This brother and basically cussed the elders out. And, well, I turned over to Matthew 5. And read to him, blessed are you, happy are you when men shall revile you and say all manner of evil against you falsely. And I just said to him, why don't you just move on? This, if the brother needs it, get it. But this flew all over him. Yeah. And what I mean is now, we buddy, we close. If I could edge that on, I could take, but see, I want him to go to heaven. And so I tell him, now getting called names and stuff, you done been through that. But so don't take all that personal. Just, it's a part of us serving God faithfully. You see, you have to do that with your closest friends. And you hope they do the same for you. But that's how sinister, see, wars and things come because this lust, see, brother, his lust was about to get the best of him, see, and a friend come along and he said, point well taken. And he's done with that from then on out, see, but that's how that gotta work. Mm-hmm. And that's what my lust could be, I'm going to take Jeremy, I don't like that. That brother got problems, I don't like what he did right here. Well, you can egg that on, see, and that ain't a lover of peace. That's a troublemaker in the church. You have to tell your friends, those you love, the truth. because you love them and you want them not to go to the bad place. And so there's so much in the church because brethren won't love each other enough to make peace among brethren. They, because that brother might get mad at them, but the point is, that's the lust James is talking about, that sinister, you covering yourself. Maybe you're a coward. Maybe you don't have the courage to face a brother, all of those things. But I just wanted to kind of articulate the sinister nature in the best of men and women if we're not careful. And say a friend comes along and says, hey, and kind of check amens their little nasty, little can't get over slights or whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so we always have to be on guard because, at that point, Brother Sutton was a mature Christian, and yet it was.
And really normally good at that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That just flew all over him, getting called out of their name.
Yeah. David.
Comment I was gonna make a issue, as parents, we try, especially when our children are younger, to keep them away from a lot of things in the world, we do. And that don't mean they always will when they get out on their own.
Yeah, we need to, I think we need to shelter our children and try to keep them away, but we need to educate them so that as they go out and confront these things, that they're not taken by surprise as well. And so there's a lot of wisdom that parents need in those areas. Any other comments there? I wanted to speak a little bit about how that sensations lose their appeal when we indulge in them too often. And so we see this in so many times today, and we look at maybe the track that a person's life takes, and we see them, we look at their life early on, and as they get older, things start spiraling out of control. And what we see is that this desire for pleasure, as you begin seeking that and taking part in these pleasurable things, the more we indulge into them, they lose their appeal. And so we're having to go to something different. The first time we do something is very exciting, but the excitement fades the more we do it. It becomes routine and boring. And so as we seek all of this pleasure, we're constantly having to up the game, so to speak. This is where the danger of chasing worldly lust is, because we're constantly having to up the game in order to satisfy these lusts. The fleshly part of our nature will never be satisfied. If we give in to that and we start letting this fleshly part of our nature rule us, it will never be satisfied. It's going to want more and more and more and more. This is very evident when we look at the lives of the rich people around us. And we look at, maybe this culture that we have in Hollywood. And all of these bad things come out with these people taking private airplanes to these islands and engaging in all of this debauchery and things like that. It's gotten to that point where they're seeking this pleasure, and it gets to this point where there's some very evil things going on because they constantly have to up the game. They do it one time, it's exciting, but by the time they've done it 100 times, it's old news. And so now I'm chasing this lust, I'm chasing these pleasures, so I've got to up the game. There's got to be something more to keep us satisfied. And so if we give ourselves over to them, we will ultimately find ourselves doing some very evil things in the pursuit of lust and pleasure. We will find ourselves captive to our own desires. Romans chapter 7, verses 23 through 25 says, but when I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. And so we will find ourselves captive to this sin, to this desire for more and more and more. We see it, I mean, it's the same thing with somebody who begins abusing drugs and alcohol. The more you partake in that, the more it takes to give you that high, to give you that buzz or whatever it is. And then it progresses, and by the end of it, you're sacrificing everything just for more. Your health, your family, your job, and ultimately your soul. Probably many of us have seen these pictures of people before and after maybe using meth. And the change is just devastating. What these people have sacrificed for things like that. And that's, that's an outward thing, but yet when you look at the inside of some of these people, maybe that are not doing drugs, but are going after maybe some of these sexual things, and stuff of that nature, just think what their soul looks like to God in comparison. The comparison of that would be just as drastic. And so we need to make sure that we don't start chasing these things. If we are to be free and servants of Christ, we must put these things away. We read this earlier, but Galatians 5 and verse 24, and those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with the passions and desires. We must crucify these things, these fleshly desires, these fleshly lusts. We must not chase them, because when we do, we end up in some very bad situations. I appreciate everyone's attention and those who participated. Lord willing, we'll start in verse 2 of James chapter 4 next week and continue on with our study there. Thank you.